Welcome to Bonnie's Beat. I'm your host, Bonnie Squires. We're coming to you from Radnor Studio 21 in beautiful downtown Wayne. And we'd like to showcase people who are important in the community, doing something in either academia, politics, the charitable world, and outstanding businesses or athletes. And today we have a very interesting guest, Phil Goldsmith, and I probably need a half hour just to read off all the titles of all the important positions he's held in the community. So we'll let him reveal. Today he's here in his guise as author, In Search of Self and Family. It's his memoir, and it's fabulous. Phil Goldsmith, so you've been, were you the youngest city managing director in Philadelphia's history?
No. I'll give you a short version of my resume. I'm a lawyer by education.
Where'd you go to law school?
I went to George Washington University in Washington, D.C.
Oh.
I graduated at Penn State. And then I practiced a year in Harrisburg, and then I switched to journalism. And I worked for the Allentown Call-Chronicle. And then I moved to Philadelphia because I had a job with the Philadelphia Inquirer. And there I was in the City Hall Bureau when Frank Rizzo was mayor and Arlen Specter was district attorney.
Interesting times,
Interesting
as they
times,
say.
yep. And then I became executive director of the Philadelphia Bar Association. Then I
I didn't know about that.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then I went back to the Inquirer on the editorial board. And then I went to work for a fellow by the name of Bill Green, who was running for mayor of Philadelphia. And he won, and I became deputy mayor of Philadelphia. And I was there for a couple years, and then I went into banking, and I became an executive at that time Provident National Bank, now known as PNC. And eventually I became the first chief executive officer of the School District of Philadelphia in 2000.
That must have been a headache.
Well, I say I was I say I was 6'5" at the time. I'm 5'9" now. But this school district was on the verge of bankruptcy, and I was there during the fight over the privatization of the school district and eventually takeover by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The mayor then asked me to become the interim head of Fairmount Park, which I did for about 8 months, and then I became chief operating officer of the city of Philadelphia, which we call the managing director's position. And I left there in 2005 and had my own consulting firm after that. And I'm retired now.
Too young to be retired.
Well, you know, I've had tough jobs, but
Very tough.
I say I'm retired from making money. I'm not retired from being active. I've been very active in the ceasefire PA, the gun control movement, and trying to get some common sense safeguards on guns. And then I decided to find out about my family and where my great-grandparents were from. And that resulted in this book, In Search of Self and Family. It's not so much a memoir of mine, that's coming next, but it's about my family history, and I'll say everyone's family history. It's the immigration experience, in my case, the Jewish immigration experience, how Jews assimilated in this country. It's about marriage and divorce and intermarriage and success and failure and different stages of my life. Now, the best stage of my life, I'm a grandfather of 5, 3 of whom live in Radnor Township. So that's where I'm at.
And you're in Lower Merion?
I'm in Lower Merion.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I knew of you from politics, and you were very active in politics. And can I say you were an active Democrat?
Yes.
That's how
sure,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, Bill Green had quite a legacy. I mean, his grandfather was a congressman.
That's right.
His father was a congressman, and he became Bill Green.
Yeah,
that's right.
No, Bill Green, that was mayor. His father was not only a congressman, but he was head of the Democratic Party in Philadelphia and a very, very influential person. And then Mayor Green's son became a city councilman, and he's now head of the School Reform Commission in Philadelphia.
Bill Green. Yeah. Well, he's no longer the head of the School Reform Commission.
That's right. He's no longer head of it.
He was,
and then Governor Wolf appointed someone else, but he's still on the.
He's still a member
yes,
School
still
Reform
on-
Commission.
yes.
Do you approve of the structure of having the state run the School Reform Commission instead of having either appointed or elected officials from Philadelphia?
Well, I'm against an elected school board in Philadelphia, and that's not to say I'm against an elected school board in Radnor, or Lower Merion, or Haverford Township. But Philadelphia is a different animal, and I think to have an elected school board would be a disaster. I was at the school district during the takeover when the negotiations were going on, and Mayor Street was the one negotiating with Governor Ridge and then Governor Schweiker. And I think the result was a good result because the state had, the result was the state was going to give Philadelphia more money, which they did, and they would appoint a 5-member school reform commission, of which 3 members would be appointed by the governor and 2 members by the mayor. So it's not totally state controlled. I think the success of the school reform commission has rested on who the members have been. I think we've had some disastrous school reform commissions because we've had members that forgot what their mission was. I think now we have a better one. I think in the past several years we've had a better school reform commission. So I think it comes down to, like everything else, it depends on who the people are, not so much the structure. But I am against an elected school board for Philadelphia.
Okay. Now, what motivated you to start to do research on your family, which ended in this very thick, very interesting book?
Yeah. I think what I started to wonder, I wasn't sure where my great-grandparents came from. I knew they came from Russia, but Russia's a big place.
Oh, yes.
And I thought it would be interesting to find out and then take a vacation to those areas where they came from. And one thing led to another. And I decided to write a book about it. And I decided this.
Did you go to Russia?
I did not. I was in Russia in 1993. I was actually there as a consultant with a couple of people I know. I was there when they tried to overthrow Boris Yeltsin, but that was a totally different thing. But I did see a woman walk down the street one day, and I said to myself, that could have been my grandmother, you know. And so that started piquing my interest. And once I got into it, once you start this search, if you will, it becomes very addictive. And I started to learn more and more and more. And I reached out to family members who either I've never met or I haven't seen for 35, 40 years. I found one cousin on my father's side. My father died in 1976, so I lost a lot of contact with his side of the family. So I met my cousin in New York, and the first thing was he apologized because he got drunk at my wedding. Well, I forgot that. And, you know, I think I might have been drunk at my wedding. So it's, you know, and then my grandfather, my mother's father, was a lawyer.
Oh, well, that's very unusual.
Well, he came to this country when he was 5 years old with his mother. His father had come 2 or 3 years earlier. They settled in Hazleton, and then my great-grandfather put him in school right away, and obviously education was key. And my grandfather ended up going to Dickinson College, graduated in 3 years, and then went to Dickinson Law School, where he boarded with a family. It turned out to be my great-grandparents, and one of their daughters became my grandmother. So it was all this interesting stuff. But the point was, being a lawyer and a very scholarly man, he saved a lot of his letters, which my mother saved, and then my sister had. So I had like 300 letters that he wrote that I found.
That's fantastic.
And I was able to use, you know, for this book. And then his son, he had 2 sons, and one of them served in the Pacific during World War II. And he, like his father, was an inveterate letter writer. He wrote a letter home virtually every day. And my cousin had those letters. And so that was what terrific.
A wealth of material.
Well, it was a wealth of material, and it was interesting because it showed the story of the war from someone out in the Pacific. It showed the relationship between parents and a son, and he had a brother who was in the Merchant Marines, and it showed a little bit of the sibling rivalry that was going on. So it was a terrific treasure trove of, you know, materials. And so every day I'd wake up and I'd find something else. It was a great search, and you know, I used my journalistic skills to find a lot of this stuff, and you know, I'm sure, and there's a lot of stuff I wasn't able to find, and I still don't know.
Well, I don't know how you were able to stop doing the research and concentrate on writing the book, because the book reads like a novel. And anybody who has family members who migrated here from another country, I mean, I know the names of my maternal great-grandparents, but I don't know anything about them really, except that my grandmother told me that her father spoke like 7 different languages. They were from Russia. My paternal grandfather was from the Ukraine, and the story he told me was that the day they conscripted him into the Tsar's army, he traded his army uniform, went to a tailor and traded it for a suit, and walked to the sea and got on a boat and came to America.
Right.
Because in those days, if a Jewish boy was conscripted into the army, the family never saw or heard from him again.
Right.
So they worried about that a lot.
Yeah.
So he left, he escaped.
Right.
And my grandmother was brought here by her father and her mother, you know, as young people, but they came between like 1916 and 1920. But
they came on the late side.
Yeah.
Because immigration stopped really like 1917, right after, you know, World War I. But that story, you know, about, you know, being conscripted, I think that happened to my great-grandfather. And he was conscripted to fight in the Sino-Japanese War. And he basically didn't want to do that. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of commonality, you know, certainly among Jews, but I think the same goes with Italians and Irish. Everyone, Poles, everyone has their story. And as I say, the only immigrants that don't have a similar story are African Americans who didn't come here voluntarily. They were chained and brought here against their will. But I think they, you know, as I say, while this is a story about my family, it could be anyone's family.
Absolutely. And there's so many interesting things here, that, you know, that I'm learning. I never even noticed that Hazleton is spelled Hazleton, but it was named for hazel trees that are Hazel, and the clerk couldn't spell, who incorporated the papers, so it's spelled wrong.
Yes.
Hazleton.
Right. Yeah. I focus a lot. I try to focus on just not telling about my family, but telling about what was going on at the time, and what was going on. So my family basically settled the Lower East Side of New York, Hazleton, Pennsylvania, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and then eventually Allentown. And so I try to tell what was going on in those areas, what was going on in the country. For example, when my grandmother was coming of age, she got married in 1916. Well, what was happening in 1916? You had World War I going on. You had the Spanish flu, which took 20 million lives around the country, which she had. Fortunately, she didn't die from it.
She survived, wow.
And then you had the woman's right to vote was just maturing. It was just coming to fruition. And we sit back and we think like, oh, people have never seen change like we see now. And I say that's nonsense. Change is constant. And but when you think about the change that our family went through, it's a lot more real to me than just reading it in the history books and so forth. And I just imagine what it must have been like, you know, particularly with the flu. I mean, it inflicted Allentown. They had a very promising DA who died of it. The mayor died of it. You know, Hazleton people died, and you know, and I have stories in the book of what was going on during those times and so forth. So it's fascinating. It really is.
You were able to trace the name changes when they got to Ellis Island too.
So, some of it. Now, one of the
tell us about the rock maker.
Well, the rock maker, I don't really know much about that. I mean, that's the only name I've seen. The story that I was told that on my father's side, our real name was Leibovitz, but my great-grandfather came over, and his papers said Goldschmidt. Eventually it became Goldsmith. Whether in fact, I was not able to track down whether the original family name was Leibovitz. I have no proof of that, just someone that told me that. And so you have a lot of that type of stuff. But it makes you think about, you know, what are facts, what are myths, what are stories, what are fables, what do we really know that's true? I laid out, for example, ages, take ages. I laid out 4 decades of census materials, 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930, for my great-grandparents on my mother's side, and put down all the ages, so what they said their age was in 1900, what they said their ages were in 1910, 1920, 1930. Now, one would think that every 10 years they got 10 years older. It wasn't that way. So it really gets you to think about.
Where did you find the census materials?
The census materials is online. Ancestry.com is a good place to look for it. It's online. The census material goes up to 1940. Census materials is only made public 72 years after the census is done. So the last...
What's the magic of 72?
I don't know what. It may be that they didn't want to come out while they thought people were still living. I don't know what the reason is.
Interesting.
So the most recent one that came out in 2012 was 1940. So you can, that's where you can find out. But the problem is every census is different, asks different questions. On my great-grandmother's side, I think the 1910 census asks, how many children did you have? How many children are living? So the answer on the census was, it was very clear. She said, or whoever wrote down the information, said she had 10 children, 5 were living.
Ooh.
But no one in my family knew that. I don't know whether it's true. So it makes you be a little bit humble in, you know, saying what are facts and what aren't facts and so forth. And the name thing is, you know, what's in a name? You know, it doesn't really matter what our name is. It's who we are as a person or as an individual, as opposed to what name someone was really given.
So you grew up in New York.
I grew up in Allentown.
Oh, Allentown, excuse me.
I did spend 3 years in New York.
Right.
Part of the story was my grandfather on my father's side, my father's father, came here. He was 11, 12 years old, and he and his brother started a handbook company, a pocketbook company, and actually built
handbags.
Handbags. They built the largest women's handbag business in the country, known as Goldsmith Brothers. And so eventually they went from, you know, coming from Minsk, Belarus, coming over the Lower East Side, eventually moved to Brooklyn, and then eventually moved to Central Park. But at some point in time, something happened to that business. So part of my search was to find out what happened, because it changed my life, because I didn't grow up on Central Park. By that time, they lost their money, or they lost a lot of their wealth. My father was without a job. My parents got divorced, and so my life changed. So, you know, when I say it's in search of self, that's part of the self that I was looking for, just what happened. And
did you ever find out what happened to Goldsmith Brothers handbags?
Yeah, but you got to buy the book to find out.
I haven't gotten to that part yet. I've only read about 100 pages.
Yes,
it reads like a novel. By the way, it's available on Amazon.com.
Thank you.
And it's fabulous, fabulous reading. It really is.
Thank you.
So if you Google Phil Goldsmith on Amazon.com, In Search of Self and Family, and the subtitle is The Story of My Family and the Times They Lived. And it's the most exciting history lesson that I've ever read. It really is.
Thank you. What happened, from what I can find out, was my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, was married, but they didn't have any children. And my grandfather wanted to make my father a partner in the business. My great aunt wanted to then, since they didn't have any children, she wanted to make her brother-in-law a partner. And the two women, my grandmother and my great aunt, fought like cats and dogs, and the two men said, the hell with it, we're going to liquidate the business, we'll each go out on our own. And that's what happened. They liquidated the business, each went out on their own, but neither of them, particularly my grandfather, was able to make it like he had. And so, you know, I used to be in the career management business in one of my, I didn't list that in my resume. And people would come to me and they'd say, thinking of going into a family business. And I'd say, better think about that. So, that sits with me a little bit. So I used to, when I was in grade school, I used to, every Christmas, give the teacher a handbag. And then, boom, the business went out, so I no longer had the handbags to give, and my grades went down. But that's, so it's all fascinating. I find it all, fascinating. And my story is really no different than anyone else's that looks for it.
Yeah, but what was the most surprising thing you found in your research? You used all your tools as a journalist, as an educator.
I had there are two first cousins in the family. They're not my first cousins, but two first cousins that got married to each other. And they were
when it was still legal.
They were rock makers.
When it was
still just
legal.
It had just been, I forget the date now, the early 1900s, and 6 weeks after they got married, or 6 months, I forget which, the Pennsylvania legislature ruled you could no longer have first cousins married. And I think that's still the law today.
Oh, yes.
A lot of states still allow first cousins. So that I never knew. I thought the most, the saddest thing that I found was I decided one of the places you get information from is cemeteries. And you go and you see the tombstones, and particularly in the Jewish religion, it will say the man's name, son of. So that way, when I found my great-grandparents' tombstones in Hazleton, it would be son of, so I would find out who my great-great-grandfather was. Okay. So I decided, I'd gone to Carlisle, I'd gone to Harrisburg, I'd gone to Allentown, obviously, and Hazleton, so I decided I wanted to go to New York. So I go to New York, and I know where my grandparents are buried, and it's a huge, it's a typical New York cemetery, and I think there are 120,000 people buried in that cemetery, which is certainly would be the second largest city in Pennsylvania.
Right.
And I've calculated it's 20% larger, or it's larger than 20% of the nations in the world. Okay.
Oh my goodness.
Henny Youngman's buried there, and so forth and so on. So I knew the plot where they were buried, and I'm driving around, and I couldn't find it. And I finally found, when you go to a cemetery, it's not like going to a theater where someone's there to show you your seat, right?
Yes.
So finally, I see someone. I said, "Can you take me to this place here?" So he said, "Yep, follow me." So I follow him in his truck, and he points. He said, "It's over there." I said, "I don't see it." He said, "It's all covered. It was all covered with weeds, with ivy. There was absolutely no recognition of it." And I tried to peel off the ivy, and I finally saw, GOLD come up on the tombstones, and I couldn't get any more out. And I started to cry. This was my grandfather and my grandmother. I mean, my grandfather, while he lost a lot of money, made some of his money back. He was a philanthropist. He was a wonderful grandfather, wonderful business, and here he was. Their tombstones were just buried, and it really, made me say, I've got to tell this story. They've got to be remembered.
Were you able to get the groundskeeper
I hired someone to do that, and for some reason, when my grandfather, he didn't have perpetual care, and my aunt, didn't die. I mean, I get that when she died, it wasn't taken care of, which was another story. I found that my aunt, who I'd lost contact with, had committed suicide, and a year before that, her son, or a year afterwards, her son committed suicide. I didn't know that. So that was my aunt and my first cousin. And so here I am learning all these stories, some of which, and I felt bad that I lost touch with them. So it's important to me that, this was a gift. I did this for my grandchildren. I mean, they're too young to understand this. And someday they'll get to know their family, and I did it on my, both my daughters are married, and I did it on, I did a little history on their parents and their grandparents.
I like the
and
way
so
you
forth.
describe that their in-laws you consider family.
Yes.
And the in-laws, cousins and in-laws, you also consider
Yes.
family.
Yeah.
So you had a lot of research to
Right.
do and an awful lot of people.
Yes. As I said, in the beginning of the book, I
Did
defined.
anybody say to you, I don't want you to write about Uncle so-and-so, we'll be embarrassed?
Well, you know what? There were some people wouldn't get back to me, and I decided I was not going to have this be a tell-all book. I mean, this wasn't the book, that type of book. This was about.
It's not Mommy Dearest.
It's not Mommy Dearest. It's not Let Me Get Even. The only person I got even with was my great aunt, who I sort of did a hatchet job on. But she's the one that ruined the family business. But there's other parts of the family that dropped out of sight, turned their back on us, and so forth. And I eventually got one of my cousins to finally contact me, and she was very helpful. But I didn't put that in the book about they walked away from the family or that, because that's not what I was. I'm looking to bring people together, not to tear them apart. And
what kind of response did you get from the relatives who've read the book?
Mostly good. I mean, no one has said, "Boy, you did a lousy job." I've gotten some very nice. Some people I haven't heard from. When I wrote this book, it's funny how things change. I said, "Okay, this is for my grandchildren, and someday, 40 years from now, someone's going to find it in the attic." And no sooner did it go on Amazon.com, I expect everyone to read it. I said, "You haven't read my book yet? I can't believe that." So
how did you get it on Amazon.com?
Amazon, it's self-published, and Amazon has I don't know if it's a subsidiary or a division called Create Space, and I could have done it myself. I hired someone to help me do it because by this time I was sick of the book and sick of my family, and didn't want to get involved in details. So it's very easy to do, and it goes on Amazon. You select your price. I selected the price of $12, and there's a Kindle version as well. So it's very easy, and I think it's great. I think it's another example of disintermediation, where you don't have to go through editors and you don't have to go through publishers. You want to tell a story, you tell your story, and if people want to
How many of these did you order printed?
Well, that's the trick of it. Amazon keeps its price down because it prints them as they're ordered.
Oh.
So now
So you don't have to stockpile them.
You don't have to stockpile. I mean, I got some, for myself and so forth, and I gave some to some people. But so that's how it works, and it comes out right away. I mean, it's not like a 1 week wait and so forth. So it's been good. So.
And you're already working on your memoir?
Yeah, I'm going to tell the story of. I actually wrote a book earlier. I kept a journal for 17 years.
17 years.
Yeah, and I decided on my 50th birthday I was going to give it to my children. And so I arranged it not chronologically but thematically. Like we had death in our family, talked about journal entries like that, my jobs, when I was in government in the early 80s, etc. And so that I gave on my 50th birthday, which was about 20 years ago. And then I have this one. So the next one is I'm writing about, it's going to be called A Philadelphia Education. And it's going to talk about sort of my view of a history of Philadelphia through the different jobs that I've had. So when I came to the Inquirer in 1970 and Rizzo was a mayor and what was going on, blah, 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 to, the school district days, certainly, to managing director, and try to tell stories about those periods of time. And I think it's going to be fascinating. I really do. I think very few people have
covered the waterfront the way you have.
The experiences, have jumped around so much. So I think it will be tales of a career vagabond or something like that. So.
Well, I can highly recommend that you go to Amazon, order a copy of In Search of Self and Family by Phil Goldsmith, because it reads like a novel. It's fabulous. Anyway, thank you, Phil Goldsmith.
Thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to your next book,
Okay,
and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you.